One quiet afternoon in a courthouse parking lot, a sharply dressed black man closes his car door, ready to head home after a long day at work. But just as he turns toward the exit, a pair of white FBI agents block his path. What begins as a cold demand to show ID turns into rough hands, a search without cause, and a pair of handcuffs locking around his wrists. They don't ask questions. They don't listen. They think they've caught a suspect. But they haven't arrested just anyone. They've dragged the state attorney off his own property. And when Elijah Banks walks free, without an apology, without a word, they won't see it as a mistake. They'll come to understand it as the beginning of the end. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The air outside the courthouse was thick with early summer heat, the kind that clung to your collar and made the pavement shimmer beneath your shoes. Elijah Banks stepped into it without flinching, his tie still knotted, suit crisp from a day in court that had run longer than expected. He carried no briefcase today, just a worn leather portfolio under his arm, a habit he'd kept from his early trial days, and walked with the calm assurance of a man who had earned his authority not from ego or entitlement, but from years of watching the law twist and learning exactly where it could be straightened. Behind him, the glass doors of the state courthouse reflected the late afternoon sun like polished armor, a reminder that in this place, appearances mattered more than most would admit. He had only made it halfway across the parking lot when the silence broke, the low growl of tires cutting too sharp across asphalt, the hiss of brakes locking just a little too fast, the jarring scrape of a government-issue SUV's door thrown wide before the engine had even settled. Elijah turned at the sound, his brow lifting slightly, not out of fear but curiosity. A second SUV pulled up from the opposite end, boxing his path, and in a matter of seconds, the air shifted. What had been the end of a long day suddenly became something else entirely. They moved with purpose, 4 of them at first, all in plain clothes but wearing the clipped pace of federal agents. One of them, taller than the rest, called out, not a greeting, not a question, but a command. "Hands where we can see them." Elijah's steps slowed. He let the portfolio drop to the ground gently, both hands rising in a steady motion that betrayed none of the confusion growing behind his eyes. He didn't ask why. He didn't challenge. Not yet. Instead, he kept his voice low, even, and loud enough to be heard over the hum of the courthouse's outdoor generators. "I'm Elijah Banks, state attorney. My credentials are in my jacket pocket." The agents didn't pause. One of them closed in fast, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back before the others could even form a proper circle. Another dug into his pocket without permission, pulling out the ID and flipping it toward the sun, as if expecting it to melt under scrutiny. "I said, I'm the state attorney," Elijah repeated, his voice still calm, but now clipped at the edges, shaped by disbelief more than fear. "You match the description of a suspect in an active case," one of them snapped, offering nothing more than that before pushing him forward against the hood of the SUV. Metal kissed his chest as hot handcuffs closed around his wrists, too tight, without care. Somewhere across the lot, a security guard from the courthouse took a few cautious steps forward, then stopped, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. The taller agent stepped into Elijah's peripheral view, holding the ID between 2 fingers like it meant nothing, like it hadn't come from the governor's office itself. "You can explain everything once we're at the field office." "You're making a mistake," Elijah said again, not pleading, not shouting, just speaking the truth plainly, as he always did. Another SUV rolled up behind the first 2. A younger man stepped out, this one in tactical gear, not plain clothes, and opened Elijah's car without a warrant, without a word. They began rummaging through his glove box, pulling out files, a laptop, even the sealed envelope he'd been preparing to deliver in person to the appeals court next door. "Hey!" "That's privileged state material," Elijah barked, louder now, straining against the cuffs, his voice finally rising, not out of panic, but fury. "Should have thought about that before showing up with the same car and billed as a suspect," someone muttered behind him. Elijah turned his head slightly, enough to catch sight of the agent rifling through his trunk, lifting his suit jacket from a hanger, and shaking it out as if expecting drugs to fall from the lining. The absurdity of it all stung more than the restraint on his wrists. The badge, the ID, the position, none of it mattered in that moment. All they saw was a black man in a suit, in the wrong place at the wrong time. They pushed him into the back of the SUV, head ducked not out of force, but choice. He knew how easily force escalated. The door slammed behind him. No one read him his rights. No one told him where they were taking him. The courthouse faded behind the tinted glass, replaced by the dull thrum of traffic and the sting of heat trapped in metal. He sat there in silence, pulse steady, jaw clenched. Not because he was surprised, but because, deep down, part of him always knew it could happen. Even to him. Even here. And the longer the ride stretched on without explanation, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a mistake. It was something worse. The holding facility sat on the edge of the city's industrial zone, tucked behind a concrete barrier and 2 rows of fencing wrapped in weathered barbed wire. From the outside, it looked more like a power substation than a place where rights were quietly suspended, where time dissolved into fluorescent silence. Inside, the coldness wasn't just in the air conditioning or the color of the walls. It was in the way people moved, in the way no one met Elijah's eyes as they passed him in the narrow hallway, in the way the agents who brought him in never once used his name, only the suspect, as though acknowledging who he really was might undo the authority they were clinging to. They had removed his belt, his watch, and his wallet before leading him through the intake process. He sat in a windowless room, alone, hands still cuffed behind his back for longer than procedure demanded, while one of the agents filled out paperwork at a desk just outside the door. When he asked to make a call, to his office, to his son, to the state governor's legal counsel, the answer came back in the form of silence, broken only by the scratch of a ballpoint pen and the humming light above his head. Elijah didn't pace. He didn't shout. He sat perfectly still, his back straight against the hard metal chair, his eyes fixed not on the wall in front of him, but on something beyond it, the shape of every decision that had led him here, the quiet calculation that tomorrow someone else might take his place and have no way out. Every passing hour folded into the next, with no explanation, no charges, and no acknowledgement of the badge they had tossed aside like a counterfeit. He had been through worse, but never like this. Never in his own jurisdiction, never in his own name. Eventually, someone opened the door. A junior officer stepped in, eyes darting between the file in his hand and Elijah's face. He looked uncomfortable, not in the way someone feels when they realize a mistake has been made, but in the way a man looks when he's just been told the person he helped detain is someone he should have never touched in the first place. He didn't speak at first, just swallowed hard, walked over with a set of keys, and unlocked the cuffs with a tension that made the air feel heavier than it already was. There's been a mix-up," the officer mumbled, not meeting Elijah's eyes as the shackles dropped into his hand. Elijah rose slowly, his shoulders stiff, the bruises on his wrists already beginning to darken. He said nothing at first, just looked down at the cuffs, then back at the officer, as if waiting for something else. An apology, an explanation, a reason to believe this was anything more than what it clearly was. But none came. "I asked to call my office 6 hours ago," Elijah said quietly. The officer nodded once, helplessly, but didn't answer. "I told your agents who I was in the parking lot. Elijah continued, his voice low, even, like someone explaining something to a child who should have known better. I identified myself. I gave them my credentials. I offered to cooperate. I wasn't part of— I know you weren't, Elijah cut in, not with venom, but with the exhaustion of someone who had spent years dismantling lies, just like the one that was about to be offered. But you're part of this now. Outside the holding room, the taller agent, Weller, if Elijah remembered correctly, stood near the exit, arms crossed, posture casual in a way that belied the severity of what had just occurred. He didn't look surprised to see Elijah walking free. He looked irritated, like a man who had expected someone else to take the fall if things got messy. "You're free to go," Weller said, voice flat, lips barely moving. "No charges filed. Your car's out front. Everything should still be there." "Should be?" Elijah echoed, arching one brow. "We didn't find anything. That's what matters." Elijah studied him, memorizing the tone, the way he shifted his weight when challenged, the cold amusement lingering just behind his professional mask. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just turned and walked past him, his steps steady, his silence more damning than anything he could have said in that moment. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the lot. His car sat where they'd parked it, the driver's door slightly ajar, glove box still hanging open. Files had been rifled through, his laptop left in the passenger seat with its case unzipped. He checked everything methodically, making note of every crease out of place, every fingerprint on the screen. Nothing missing, but everything touched. By the time he pulled out of the lot, the anger had settled into something colder, something sharper. Not outrage, not disbelief, just a steady, deliberate understanding. This had not been a mistake, not really. It had been a message, and messages could be answered. He drove through the city without the radio on, the hum of the road steady beneath the tires, the lights changing in slow rhythm as dusk took hold. When he reached his house and stepped inside, his son looked up from the kitchen table, his face tightening when he saw the bruises, but not asking anything. Not yet. Elijah met his eyes and gave a small nod, just enough to say, "I'm here. We'll talk later." He went upstairs, changed out of the suit, and sat at his desk long after nightfall, the same desk where 1,000 decisions had passed through his hands. But tonight, there was no paperwork, no calendar reminders, no legal codes to flip through. Just one name, Weller, written on a blank notepad, underlined once. He didn't circle it. He didn't scribble it in anger. He just stared at it, until the letters stopped being a name and became something else entirely. A target. The morning after his release arrived like every other weekday morning in the capital, with sirens in the distance, traffic spilling across overpasses, and city workers dragging garbage bins down alleys, slick with last night's heat. But inside Elijah Banks's home, the silence felt heavier than usual. The coffee in his mug had gone cold on the desk beside him, untouched. His suit jacket was already hanging on the back of the chair, his tie looped neatly beside it, but he hadn't moved to dress. Not yet. Instead, he sat at the edge of his bed, with one sock on, the notepad from the night before still in his hand. Weller's name now joined by 3 more beneath it. Titles, estimated ranks, what he remembered from the ride over, and the half-heard conversations during booking. Downstairs, his son hovered in the hallway, pretending to scroll through his phone while glancing up every few minutes, clearly wanting to ask what had happened, but not sure where to begin. Elijah spared him the burden, stepping past with a hand on his shoulder, a light squeeze, and a quiet, "We'll talk this weekend." At the office, no one said anything directly. Not at first. A few staff members gave him longer looks than usual. One of the younger clerks handed him coffee with a nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. Carmen Brooks, his chief investigator and longtime confidant, waited until the door to his private office was closed before speaking. "I saw it online," she said, placing her phone on the desk with a paused video already pulled up. Low-res, grainy footage from someone's phone across the parking lot. It showed the agents moving in, Elijah turning with both hands raised, the cuffs flashing in the sun as he was shoved against the SUV. No audio, no context, but none was needed. He didn't flinch as he watched it again. Just exhaled slowly through his nose, then leaned back in his chair and looked at her with that calm he always carried when the stakes got high. "I want every camera angle from the courthouse. Loading dock, street corner, employee garage, everything," he said, already opening his laptop. "Talk to the marshal's office. Tell them it's related to a personnel investigation. Internal state security. They'll comply faster." Carmen folded her arms but didn't move yet. "Elijah, you want to talk about what happened?" He shook his head once. "No, I want it documented." There was no anger in his voice, no thunder, just a clarity that reminded her of the way he spoke during closing arguments, when the weight of a case had already tilted in his favor and all that remained was the final step. Not to persuade, but to confirm. She gave a single nod, then left the office without another word. By noon, Elijah had drafted 3 subpoenas, narrow in scope, disguised as routine compliance checks, but each designed to intercept communication logs from the local FBI field office. Nothing that would trigger alarm. Nothing that would raise flags. Just enough to begin mapping where the cracks were. He reached out to a contact in the administrative court who owed him a favor and secured expedited approval. By 2 o'clock, the paperwork had already been walked across the street by a junior aide who didn't even realize what he was carrying. Carmen returned with access logs from the courthouse garage and security footage from a camera that overlooked the sidewalk Elijah had crossed just before the arrest. The footage didn't lie. He had clearly identified himself, clearly displayed his ID, clearly stated his title. The audio was weak, but the body language told the rest. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't escalated. They had simply chosen not to listen. Elijah stared at the screen, slow replaying the clip again and again until the agent's movements became mechanical in his mind, each step etched in detail. When Carmen leaned over to speak again, her voice was lower now, sharper. "They didn't just disregard your ID, Elijah. They ignored everything that could have stopped it. That's not negligence. That's pattern." He looked up at her, expression unreadable, then reached for the yellow legal pad on his desk and began writing names again. The list was growing. "Start looking into prior complaints," he said. "Anything filed against Agents Weller, Donahue, Ramirez, or Stone. Go back 5 years, civilian and interagency. Use non-public sources. Tap into the Ombudsman records, even if we have to push." Carmen hesitated. "They'll find out we're digging." "I'm counting on it." That night, Elijah didn't go straight home. He drove past the courthouse, slowing at the exact spot where the SUVs had cornered him. The lot was empty now, street lamps humming softly above oil-stained pavement. He stared at the curb for a long time before pulling away, driving with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping a flash drive tucked into his coat pocket. A copy of the footage he'd already backed up in 3 locations. One copy would be sent to a secure archive, another to his private legal counsel. When he finally stepped into the house, Eric was waiting at the kitchen table again. A sandwich, half-eaten, schoolwork spread around him like a shield. "You okay?" he asked, not looking up. Elijah paused, then nodded. "I will be." He meant it, but not in the way most people use that phrase. Not as a reassurance or a deflection. He meant it like a promise, not to heal, but to fix what had allowed this to happen. To him, to others. Upstairs, The notepad had more names than it had room for, and tomorrow it would have more. The office lights had dimmed into motion-sensing silence by the time Carmen returned with the records. She didn't knock, just nudged the door open with her shoulder, a cardboard box in her arms, and a look on her face that told Elijah everything he needed to know before a single word passed between them. She set the box on his desk without ceremony, then reached in and pulled out the first folder, a thick manila packet with red tabs along the edges. More followed, not one or two, but a dozen at least, each one stamped with complaint numbers, internal memorandums, and review seals that looked official enough to suggest thoroughness, but hollow enough to suggest the opposite. "I started with Weller," Carmen said, flipping open the top file. "But the trail doesn't end with him. Donahue and Ramirez are named in at least 4 of the same complaints. Different names, different case numbers, same pattern." Elijah leaned forward slowly, the chair creaking beneath him as he took the first folder from her hands and began reading. The names were unfamiliar, but the stories weren't. A man pulled over without cause, held in custody for nearly 8 hours after refusing to consent to a vehicle search. A woman who'd been stopped outside her own apartment complex, questioned aggressively in front of her children, then threatened with obstruction when she asked for a badge number. Each report had the same conclusion: insufficient evidence to pursue disciplinary action. Each one ended in silence. "Were these reviewed?" Elijah asked, though the question was mostly for formality. The answer had already made itself clear in the way the files were organized. No follow-up memos, no secondary interviews, no final recommendations. Just signatures, boxes checked, and dates filed away without action. "Surface level only," Carmen confirmed. "Looks like they were pushed through standard intake, then dismissed before they made it past first review. No IA involvement, no escalation. And no media leaks. Not one, which means the victims either didn't push or were made to feel like it wasn't worth it." Elijah closed the folder and sat back, pressing his fingertips together in front of his face. He was thinking now, not just as an attorney, but as someone who had spent his career watching institutional rot wrap itself in layers of red tape, each layer designed not to protect the public, but to protect the narrative. The agents hadn't just been careless with him, they had been comfortable. Comfortable enough to act in daylight, comfortable enough to disregard credentials, comfortable enough to do it at a courthouse where every corner had a camera and every corridor echoed with the memory of prosecution. This wasn't a misstep. It was a routine. He stood and crossed to the wall where the city map hung in a steel frame, dotted with small pins from old cases, most of them faded or bent at the tip. Carmen followed his gaze as he lifted one hand and tapped the south loop, near the 6th precinct. "This is where the woman lived. The one with the 2 kids," he said. Carmen nodded. 3 blocks from where Weller's task force ran that informant raid last fall. He tapped again, this time closer to the old freight yards. "And this one?" "Adjacent to the transit corridor. Ramirez filed that stop under a narcotics sweep. But there was no sweep that night. I checked." He turned to face her. "How many of these do we think exist? Unfiled? Buried? Redirected?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "Dozens. Maybe more. I can't get a full count without clearance." "The feds lock their IA complaints behind a firewall we don't have access to." Elijah nodded once, then walked back to his desk, pulling open the bottom drawer where he kept the paperwork most attorneys preferred to avoid. Emergency judicial orders, investigative authorizations, and, tucked deep near the back, a set of sealed files labeled Legislative Intercession Review. Legal tools only state attorneys could use, and only under extraordinary justification. He slid the file out slowly, laid it flat on the desk, and opened it. Carmen didn't ask what he planned to do, She knew, and she didn't stop him. By the time the paperwork was filled out and signed, it was nearly midnight. The fax machine outside his office sputtered to life as he sent the authorization directly to Judge Doyle's private clerk. He didn't need a court date. Not for this. Not yet. What he needed was access. Full access. The kind that cut through jurisdictional walls and stripped away the bureaucratic language shielding federal files from state inquiry. It was a dangerous move, the kind that got careers stalled, allies nervous, and phone calls from Washington. But it was also the kind that pulled the curtain back. He sent the final form with a slow, deliberate press of the button, then leaned back and stared at the screensaver glowing softly on his monitor. The state seal rotating against a blue backdrop, formal and dignified, but hollow now in ways he couldn't unsee. "This doesn't stay internal," Carmen said finally, breaking the silence. "You know that, right?" "I know," Elijah replied, voice low. "But it starts that way. Let's see who tries to stop it." And in the quiet that followed, the two of them sat among the files, surrounded by the weight of names no one had fought for. Until now. The first sign that they knew came not through a phone call or a formal memo, but through the silence that followed Elijah's court filings. Requests that usually returned within hours began to stall. A courthouse liaison who had always been helpful suddenly couldn't locate routine files. One of Carmen's email accounts received a login alert from an unfamiliar IP address registered to a federal subnet. These weren't coincidences. They were warning shots, the kind sent when people with power realize their insulation is thinning, and the person poking holes in the walls doesn't scare easily. Elijah responded the only way he knew how, by moving faster. He expedited the subpoenas through Judge Doyle's office, citing state oversight protocols. He opened a private channel with a small group of deputy attorneys across several counties, feeding them pieces of information under sealed briefs so they couldn't be targeted as easily. And quietly, behind closed doors, he authorized Carmen to begin compiling a protected witness list. Not for court, not yet, but for the day when this became too large to contain. He expected pushback. What he didn't expect was for it to walk straight into his office unannounced. It was late afternoon, the halls thinning out as most staff wrapped up their day, when the receptionist called through the intercom, her voice strained. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. Says it's personal." Elijah didn't answer right away. Just stared out the window a moment longer, watching a rainstorm begin to gather over the skyline. The clouds folding low over the buildings like a curtain slowly being pulled. He already knew who it would be before the door opened. Weller didn't bother with pleasantries. He stepped in like he owned the place, dressed in a sport coat now, civilian clothes that couldn't hide the posture of a man used to weapons and commands. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He closed the door gently behind him and leaned against it, arms crossed, eyes sharp and unblinking. "You've been busy," he said, voice low, carrying that kind of false casualness that meant trouble was coming, only dressed better. Elijah didn't rise from his desk. He didn't ask why Weller was there. He simply folded his hands and looked at the man the way he might examine a defendant who had just made the mistake of speaking under oath too soon. "You're not supposed to be here," Elijah replied evenly. "Federal agents don't conduct unannounced visits to state attorneys without formal coordination." Weller smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "I'm not here as an agent. I'm here as a man who's starting to feel like he's being hunted." Elijah didn't blink. "Funny. That's exactly how I felt in the back of your SUV." The room settled into stillness. Weller let the words hang for a moment before pushing off the door and walking toward the desk slowly, as if circling prey, as if calculating just how far he could lean before he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I get it," Weller said. "You're pissed. You got your suit wrinkled and your pride bruised, And now you think burning down the whole field office is going to fix that. But let me tell you something, Banks. This crusade? It's not going to go how you think. Elijah leaned back slightly, arms resting on the chair's arms, calm as ever. You should choose your words carefully. I am, Weller said, voice sharpening. You want to play hero? Fine. But heroes don't last in this business. They get swallowed, forgotten, buried under process and paperwork. You start pulling at threads, and sooner or later, something pulls back. Elijah stood now, not rushed, not aggressive, just meeting Weller at eye level. The air between them tightened like a wire drawn too taut, neither man willing to blink first. You came here to scare me? Elijah asked. I came here to warn you, Weller replied. This isn't some low-level precinct issue. You don't know how deep it goes. Then you should have left me alone, Elijah said, his voice colder now. You had a chance to do your job right, to listen, to think before dragging a state official into custody without cause. You didn't just break protocol, Weller. You showed the world how casually you treat power when no one's watching. And now someone is. Weller's jaw tightened. He didn't respond right away. Just stared at Elijah like he was trying to see through him, like he was searching for weakness and not finding any. You're making enemies you can't see, he said at last. And you're mistaking silence for safety, Elijah replied. The room held one last beat of quiet before Weller stepped back toward the door, hand on the knob. I won't say it again, he said. Back off. I didn't need you to say it the first time, Elijah answered, already sitting again, already reaching for the next file in a growing stack of sealed documents. Weller left without another word. Carmen returned a minute later, having seen the agent leave through the front. She closed the door behind her and said nothing for a long moment. Elijah looked up, his face calm but unreadable. He's rattled, Carmen said. He wouldn't come here unless he felt the ground shifting. He's scared, Elijah corrected. And scared men do stupid things. She glanced at the door. Want me to call security next time? No, he said, eyes already moving back to the folder in front of him. Let them keep coming. Every visit is just more proof. And with that, the investigation continued. Now not just with purpose, but with urgency. The enemy was no longer hiding in files and silence. Now they had faces. The days that followed Weller's visit unfolded with the rhythm of something approaching war. Not loud, not declared, but unmistakable to anyone who understood how institutional pressure made itself known. Requests that had previously been acknowledged with automatic compliance were now met with delays. Court clerks who once answered on the first ring began sending Elijah's calls to voicemail. The Bureau's media liaison issued a vague public statement about unfounded allegations undermining federal cooperation, without naming names. But everyone in the loop knew exactly who they were talking about. It wasn't just procedural slowdown anymore. It was a coordinated signal. And Elijah didn't flinch. He doubled his pace, tasking Carmen with running background traces on key agents whose names appeared across multiple complaints. He looped in a forensic analyst he trusted from his days in the DA's office, having her dig into metadata from doctored police reports that didn't match timestamps on arrest logs. One by one, the inconsistencies multiplied. Too many to be explained away as oversight, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Witnesses began to talk, but not in public. They came in quietly. Former defendants, probation officers, even a retired field agent who'd moved out of state and had nothing left to lose. They described a unit that operated without boundaries, one that regularly bypassed proper channels under the guise of national interest or active surveillance, covering illegal stops and unreported detainments behind jargon and paperwork buried deep enough that most never found it. One man, middle-aged and soft-spoken, arrived with no attorney and a trembling hand that barely kept his coffee still as he spoke. He told Elijah and Carmen about being held for 2 days without formal booking, locked in a supply room and questioned about friends he no longer spoke to, all because he was spotted near a location under bureau surveillance. No charges were filed, no report was made. And when he tried to report the incident to Internal Affairs, he was warned that his immigration paperwork had errors, a not-so-subtle reminder of what could be taken if he didn't stay quiet. Carmen documented every word, filed every sworn affidavit, and cross-checked details against the growing web they were building. One full of unexplained detours, edited security logs, and badge swipes that didn't match timestamps. Still, Elijah knew information wasn't enough. This needed to be airtight, protected, and ready for the storm that would come the moment it went public. And then, one night, as he left the office later than usual, the first real escalation arrived. The parking garage beneath the state complex was nearly empty, the echo of his footsteps trailing behind him as he made his way toward his car. The lights overhead flickered as they often did, old wiring reacting to a power grid constantly stretched thin. He noticed the car parked across from his own, nondescript, engine cold, no tags visible, but thought little of it until he saw the shadow move just a second too late. It wasn't much, just the shift of someone ducking low, the faint creak of a door easing closed rather than slamming shut. Elijah didn't approach. He turned slowly, walked back to the stairwell, and made a call. By the time Carmen and 2 off-duty officers he trusted arrived, the car was gone. No tire marks, no security footage. The nearest camera had been turned slightly, just enough to miss the space where both vehicles had been. The message was clear. "Testing your routine," Carmen muttered, as they stood by the empty space. He nodded once. "Next time they won't just watch." They relocated the files to an off-site archive that night, a privately secured facility tied to an inactive civil case Elijah had handled 3 years prior, a location no one would think to look at unless they were already deep in the weeds. He rerouted all digital communications through encrypted servers, and for the first time since the investigation began, he pulled his son out of school for a week and sent him to stay with his uncle across state lines. When Carmen asked if he was being paranoid, Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew what it looked like when a system started to turn inward, when silence wasn't enough, when pressure stopped working. He had seen it before, in other cities, in smaller courts, in cases that never made the news because someone decided the cost of exposure was too high, but this time it was personal. And whoever had decided to follow him through that garage was going to learn that he had no interest in backing off. Not now. Not with the truth so close he could practically feel it in the weight of the documents he carried each night. The next morning, an email arrived from an anonymous burner account. No words, just an attachment. A photo taken from a high vantage point across from Elijah's home, zoomed in, grainy, time-stamped at 3:47 a.m. He looked at it for a long time, then deleted it without comment. Carmen found out hours later when she was reviewing internal alerts tied to Elijah's inbox. "You didn't report it?" she asked. "No need," he said. "They want me to know they're watching. That's not fear. That's desperation." She didn't argue, but the look in her eyes shifted. The weight of what they were walking into was no longer theoretical. And as the sun dipped again behind the clouds that never quite cleared, Elijah stood at his office window, arms crossed, watching the street below. Not for danger, but for movement, for change, for the moment when everything they had been building would finally tip. They weren't going to scare him off, but they were getting ready to try. It had been 2 days since the surveillance photo landed in Elijah's inbox, and the pressure had only grown heavier. Not louder, that would have been easier to name, to confront, but heavier, in the way shadows lingered longer around corners, in the way routine conversations were suddenly filled with subtext, in the way he started noticing the same black SUV parked near the courthouse 3 mornings in a row. Carmen had urged him to report it formally, to escalate protection. But Elijah knew the moment he did that, everything would be dragged into the open, and the case would no longer be his to steer. Bureaucracy would descend with 1,000 hands, each one claiming to help, but really there to contain the fallout. So he stayed quiet, calculated, moved with purpose. But paranoia wasn't the same as preparedness. It was just past 9 when he left the community round table. The event had been sparsely attended, mostly public defenders and local church leaders, but he'd needed to show his face, needed to keep the public narrative steady while the real battle unfolded behind the scenes. Eric had insisted on coming with him, not out of curiosity, but out of a quiet, protective instinct that had grown stronger over the past week. Elijah hadn't wanted him there, but his son hadn't asked. He'd simply climbed into the car, backpack slung over one shoulder, headphones around his neck. They didn't speak much on the drive back. The streets were mostly empty, the late hour painting the city in long stretches of amber streetlight and deep pockets of stillness. Elijah kept one hand on the wheel and the other near his phone, thumb resting against the silent vibrate setting, a habit now more than precaution. They turned onto their street, a quiet block lined with narrow trees and darkened porches. Just as the SUV emerged from the far end, lights off, engine low. It moved slowly, as if matching pace with Elijah's car, but kept a half-block distance, never getting close enough to provoke, never far enough to disappear. Eric noticed it first. "Dad." "I see it," Elijah said, his voice calm, steady. He made the decision to drive past their house, looping through the neighborhood instead of pulling into the driveway. The SUV followed. No turns, no signals, just a straight trail behind them. Now a little closer. "I need you to get down," Elijah said quietly. "What?" "Eric, now." The boy hesitated for just a second, then ducked low, sliding down in the seat with his hands over his head, heart pounding so hard Elijah could hear it from the driver's side. The first shot hit the rear windshield. Not a warning. Not a misfire. Just the sudden crack of tempered glass imploding inward, followed by the screech of tires behind them as the SUV surged forward. Elijah accelerated without panic, eyes scanning the rearview mirror, heart already calculating options. The engine roared as he took a hard left onto Holloway. Then another right onto a side street rarely used at night, but they were still behind him. He could see the outline of a weapon now, the shape of a man leaning from the window, readying for a second shot. The next one hit the driver's side panel. Sparks jumped from metal as Elijah jerked the wheel again, swerving between parked cars, every move fueled not by fear, but by a deep, cold clarity. He needed to draw them out, away from homes, away from witnesses, but not so far that he'd lose the chance to respond. He reached the industrial zone in minutes, the car weaving past closed warehouses and shuttered shipping docks. The road here was rough, lined with gravel and half-lit by broken security lamps. The SUV followed, still pressing close, still trying to force him off course. Elijah made one last sharp turn into a narrow alleyway, slammed the brakes, and grabbed Eric by the shoulder. "Out! Now!" The boy hesitated, stunned. "Out, Eric!" They bolted from the car, just as another round tore through the rear fender. Elijah pushed his son behind a stack of crates, shielding him with his own body, then reached into his jacket and pulled out the emergency signal device Carmen had insisted he carry. It wasn't much, just a ping to a prearranged network of local officers, but it would be enough if they could survive the next few minutes. The SUV pulled into the alley and stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a door opened. Elijah didn't wait. He pushed Eric lower behind the crates and stepped out slowly, hands raised but posture defiant. The light behind him cast long shadows, hiding the full extent of his face, but the resolve in his stance was unmistakable. "You've already missed," he said, voice clear across the alley. "And I don't run." There was no response. Just the hum of the engine and the quiet shuffle of boots on gravel. Then, tires peeled. The SUV backed out fast, disappearing around the corner just as sirens began to echo faintly in the distance, growing louder. By the time Carmen arrived at the scene, Elijah was standing with one hand braced against the side of the crates, blood on his sleeve from where a shard of glass had grazed him. Eric sat nearby, wide-eyed, pale, but silent. "They tried to kill you," she said, the words dry in her mouth. "No," Elijah murmured. "They tried to scare me." Carmen stared at him. "You still think you're not in a war?" Elijah turned toward the flashing lights that had begun to fill the alley, his expression unreadable, voice flat. "No, I think they just told me how scared they really are." The alleyway attack didn't make the news that night. It didn't appear on morning broadcasts or in the city's early papers. The report filed by responding officers was marked as unknown assailants, and the SUV's plates, as Elijah had expected, came back registered to a shell company with no traceable owner. There was no public manhunt, no citywide alert, just a quiet intake, a few polite questions, and the vague suggestion that perhaps the gunfire had been mistaken for fireworks, despite the casings still warm when they arrived. But Elijah hadn't expected justice from procedure. He expected denial, and that meant the next move had to come from him. By the end of the following day, he had called in every favor he was owed. He contacted Judge Doyle directly, submitting a sealed motion to bypass standard evidence review protocols and requesting full access to sealed internal correspondence between the Bureau's field office and its Washington liaison. The request was precise, citing state oversight authority and referencing past abuse cases as precedent. Doyle didn't argue. She granted the motion without delay, and Elijah had the signed order in hand before the ink was dry. From there, things moved quickly. Carmen traced the shell company linked to the SUV to a property management group that controlled multiple abandoned buildings across the industrial corridor, the same corridor where at least 3 of the earlier complaints had originated. She flagged photos from the attack site that showed an adjacent building with a shattered upper window and sent them to Elijah with a single note. They were watching long before we arrived. He forwarded the images, along with a carefully worded summary of the attack, to his off-the-record contact at the Ledger, one of the few remaining investigative papers that hadn't yet folded under corporate pressure. He didn't ask them to publish. He didn't have to. By the following afternoon, the headline was quietly running on their online column. State Attorney Survives Alleged Ambush, linked to ongoing misconduct probe. It didn't name names, but it changed everything. Within hours, the courthouse buzz shifted. Staff who had previously kept their heads down began dropping quiet notes into Carmen's inbox. A former intake officer came forward, requesting to meet off-site. She brought with her a copy of an unredacted booking report from 2 years earlier, one that named Weller and Ramirez directly in a hold that had never been filed. A man detained under the label Covert Investigative Interest, who had vanished from the system without explanation. Elijah hadn't seen that name in any public log, but now it was in his hands. And it wasn't the only one. Public defenders began to call, quietly at first, then steadily, voices low and careful. They recounted clients who had disappeared for days, arraignments that were postponed without notice, hearings where no paperwork arrived because it had never been submitted. Carmen began assembling a timeline on the wall of Elijah's office, each incident marked with thread and tape, slowly revealing a map that stretched across precincts, neighborhoods, and years. At the center of it all was the same unit, the same names, the same pattern. But it wasn't just volume that made the case stronger. It was what came next. A former bureau tech specialist, quiet, nervous, and reluctant even under promise of anonymity, agreed to meet Elijah in the basement of a university law library where he once gave guest lectures. The man didn't speak much. He simply handed over a flash drive and a handwritten note. They've been deleting internal communications manually. Not from the system, from the backups. These are recovery logs. I had to strip encryption from the secondary layer. Use it carefully. Elijah said nothing as he took the drive, just nodded once, then left without looking back. That night, Carmen decrypted the files in silence. The messages were short, clinical, but unmistakable. Internal memos acknowledging unsanctioned field interviews, off-grid detainment, and the use of informal location holdings for non-compliant subjects. There were timestamps, sender IDs, approval codes. It was a roadmap to everything they had suspected. But now, it wasn't theory. It was proof. And with proof came risk. Carmen's car was broken into 3 days later. Nothing was stolen. The glove box was rifled through, her files untouched, but her rearview mirror had been tilted downward, just enough to suggest someone had been sitting in the driver's seat, watching, waiting. She didn't report it. She didn't need to. Elijah reviewed the footage again, not from the alley, but from the files recovered, the surveillance logs, the deleted data Carmen had pieced together. It wasn't just systemic. It was structured, maintained, supervised. They weren't dealing with rogue agents. They were dealing with a sanctioned system, one that had been operating in plain sight under the protection of language, of policy, of silence. And now, the silence was breaking. The press began to stir. The Ledger's article was picked up by a national outlet. A civil rights organization filed a formal request for an inquiry into Elijah's arrest, citing public records and the newly surfaced evidence. Protesters began to gather outside the Bureau's field office, not in large numbers, not yet, but enough to attract cameras, enough to remind the agents behind the windows that people were watching now. Elijah sat with Judge Doyle in her chambers the following evening, both of them looking over the files, the photographs, the tangled history of names. "You're pushing a heavy stone uphill," she said quietly. He nodded. "But at least now, they can't pretend it isn't there." She signed the next batch of subpoenas without hesitation. As he left her chambers and stepped out into the long marble corridor, Elijah passed a news crew setting up near the courthouse steps. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. He just adjusted his tie, tightened the grip on his briefcase, and walked straight through the center of the frame, silent and unshaken, knowing the fight was only beginning, but knowing, too, that the truth was finally louder than their fear. The wall inside Elijah's office had become something else entirely now. Not just a workspace, not just a board of reference, but a living map of failure, of abuse, of names that had been overlooked for years while the system folded itself into silence. Carmen had filled it edge to edge with pinned reports, printed emails, location markers, and court case numbers that traced their way across the city and out into neighboring counties. Red thread looped between them like veins, tying together stories that had, until now, been treated as isolated, unrelated mistakes. But they weren't mistakes. They were method. And it wasn't just Elijah who saw it. Over the last week, more people began stepping forward, not just victims, but staffers, junior attorneys, a retired paralegal from an old public defense firm who had noticed familiar language in detainment records years ago and filed a memo no one had read. A former city judge, now living in another state, submitted a sworn statement that he had once raised concerns about the same agent's behavior after a case fell apart under scrutiny. His letter had been ignored. Now it sat on Elijah's desk, weighty with hindsight. It wasn't only the volume that mattered, it was the pattern. Carmen began color-coding the strings on the board. Red for unlawful detainment, blue for undocumented searches, green for sealed cases reopened through Elijah's orders. She noticed something subtle at first. A string of locations clustered near train yards, industrial parks, and shipping depots, places where oversight was thin and security cameras, if they existed, weren't connected to public systems. She cross-referenced addresses with bureau vehicle logs, used historical location data from a pair of traffic tickets filed by city police against unmarked government cars, and slowly began to piece together an unregistered circuit. What she found wasn't just illegal, it was orchestrated. The Bureau's field office had quietly used a loop of neglected properties and closed warehouses as unofficial detainment sites, slipping suspects through gray zones where booking wasn't required and access wasn't recorded. The properties weren't owned by the Bureau. That would have been traceable. Instead, they were leased under aliases, filtered through shell companies registered to out-of-state real estate groups. But the leaseholders had federal clearances, and at least 2 of the buildings had been active during Elijah's own ambush. He reviewed her findings without speaking at first, jaw clenched, fingers folded tightly across his mouth. When he finally did speak, his voice was quieter than usual. "How long?" "Best guess?" Carmen said, arms crossed as she leaned against the desk. 5 years, maybe 6. "And no one saw it?" She shook her head. "I think they did. They just didn't want to know what it meant." The investigation had taken on a shape of its own now, something larger than even Elijah had anticipated. It had become too big to hold in one office, too complex to manage through paper trails alone. He knew it was time to build outward, to create redundancy, to ensure that if anything happened to him or Carmen or anyone else tied too closely to the case, the work wouldn't stop. He arranged for copies of all files to be secured in 3 different legal archives, each under sealed trust agreements. He assigned portions of the case to trusted attorneys in neighboring districts, dividing the materials not just by geography, but by risk, ensuring no one office carried too much at once. Carmen called it defensive architecture. Elijah called it survival. And still, the pressure grew. One of the witnesses who had testified under seal was followed leaving the courthouse. His car was vandalized 2 days later, tires slashed, back window smashed. Nothing was taken. Everything had been touched. The man called Elijah personally, voice shaking, and asked if his statement could be retracted. Elijah understood. He didn't push, but he also didn't remove the testimony from the case file. Instead, he forwarded it, along with photographs of the damage and a timeline of the harassment, to the Federal Inspector General's office, accompanied by a blunt letter that opened with a single line: "If your silence continues, it will become evidence." The media requests had multiplied, but Elijah remained cautious. He offered no interviews, gave no quotes, and spoke only through official filings. But Carmen had begun preparing something different. A public summary, a timeline of what had happened, built to be understood not in legal terms but in human ones. She kept it in a locked drawer, untouched, waiting for the right moment. And in the midst of all of it, she found something unexpected. Buried in an old housing complaint, tied to a now-closed community center once raided under suspicion of harboring gang affiliates, was the name of a young man who had vanished shortly after the sweep. His case had been closed quietly, with no follow-up. But in one document, barely legible from the poor quality of the scan, was a name listed under unofficial transport authorization: Agent Troy Weller. There had been no charge filed. No log of the boy's release. No public record of where he'd gone. Elijah stared at the name, then at the faded photograph Carmen had recovered. A boy no older than 16, wearing a borrowed tie in a blurry ID photo. "Find his family," Elijah said, his voice steady. "They're listed out of state now. Relocated 2 years ago. Phone disconnected. Then find who helped them leave. Someone knows what happened." As Carmen nodded and began gathering her files, Elijah stood once more by the wall of string and documents, his eyes tracing the red lines as if reading a language no one else could see. What had started as retaliation was now revelation. The closer he got to the truth, the more it became clear that this was never about his arrest. It had been about everyone who had been silenced before him, buried by paperwork, erased by fear. And now, for the first time in years, their names were being spoken again. By the end of the month, Elijah's office was no longer just a place where legal work was done. It had become a staging ground, the eye of a storm that had begun pulling in voices from every corner of the city. The air inside carried the weight of momentum, of something too large to pause now, too urgent to ignore. Files moved constantly, between hands, across desks, into sealed envelopes carried down quiet hallways under escort. Even the courthouse janitors noticed the change. They stopped mopping certain floors during working hours, choosing instead to slip through in silence, nodding when they passed Elijah, but never saying much, as if they too understood that something was happening here, something they'd waited a long time to see. It wasn't just city pressure anymore. It had begun to reach beyond state lines. One of the sealed subpoenas Elijah filed 2 weeks prior had triggered a formal response from Washington, not through an open channel, but through a sudden audit request, demanding to review the administrative scope of Elijah's authority over interagency records. It was dressed in polite language, stamped with the seal of a federal oversight board, but its intent was plain: to stall, to muddy the waters, to find something they could twist into overreach. He responded with precision, attaching a full chronology of judicial approvals, including Judge Doyle's emergency ruling and supporting affidavits from 4 independent prosecutors across 3 counties. Each line in the letter was clean, direct, and unshakable. By then, the media had caught the scent of something far deeper than an isolated case. The Ledger's early reports had grown into a series. National outlets began digging into past cases, pulling court records, cross-referencing names Elijah had already identified. Independent watchdogs filed FOIA requests. A leaked internal memo from the Bureau's regional office referred to the investigation as a destabilizing optics crisis. It was the first honest description they'd issued. But the real shift came from inside. One of Weller's former subordinates, a mid-level agent named Curtis Monroe, had submitted a request for transfer weeks earlier. He had stayed quiet until now, not answering Elijah's earlier outreach, ignoring Carmen's attempts to meet. But one morning, without notice, he walked into the state attorney's building with nothing but a flash drive in his jacket and a look in his eyes that said he'd made peace with the cost. Elijah met with him in private, just the two of them. No recording, no staff, no pressure. Monroe didn't waste time. "There's a reason you couldn't find body cam footage for the detainments," he said, voice quiet but certain. "They weren't just lost. They were purged." Elijah studied him carefully, letting the man speak without interruption. "They used internal flags, not the standard ones. We had a backdoor override for off-grid operations. Cameras could be disabled remotely. Files could be tagged for non-standard compliance and routed for internal-only review. And once that happened, there was no chain of custody, no outside audit. It disappeared." Elijah asked only one question. "How many times?" Monroe exhaled through his nose, as if bracing for judgment. More than a dozen that I saw personally. And I wasn't in the room for half of what happened. He placed the flash drive on the desk and slid it forward. These are internal logs, not videos, but metadata, timestamp records, flagging history, access logs. It's the paper trail behind the footage you'll never recover. Why now? Elijah asked. Monroe looked down for a long moment, then answered without looking up. Because I watched a boy cry in a stairwell after we pulled him off the street without cause. Because I watched someone fake a warrant signature. Because no one else is doing anything about it. Elijah didn't offer thanks. He simply reached out, took the drive, and nodded once. The next step was swift. Carmen and the digital forensics team cross-referenced Monroe's metadata with previously dismissed cases. Nearly every timeline matched. One of the cases, long buried, involved a man who'd spent 17 months in county detention before the charges were thrown out for lack of evidence. He had been stopped under high-priority suspicion, a phrase that appeared across several logs tied to Weller's team. Elijah had seen it before, but now it wasn't just vague language. It was a marker, a trigger used to bypass oversight. He brought it to Judge Doyle that same night. They sat in her chambers, late again, light pooling from a single lamp, while the rest of the building slept. Doyle reviewed the file line by line, glasses low on her nose, her silence growing heavier as she read. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't one of surprise. It was weariness, familiarity, recognition of something long suspected and now finally made real. "I can issue a protective order for Monroe," she said. "But you'll need to file with the state board if you want to take this public." "I'm already preparing the report," Elijah replied, "but it won't be public until it's bulletproof." Doyle tapped the last page with her finger. "You're not just pushing an investigation anymore, Elijah. You're preparing to take apart an institution." He held her gaze. "Then it's about time someone did." Outside, the hallway was empty, the echo of his footsteps stretching down marble corridors that had once felt too grand to challenge. But tonight, they were just halls, and he was no longer walking through them alone. The walls were beginning to crack, and with every name added to the board, with every truth uncovered, the weight of what had been done was becoming too much to bury. By the second week of public pressure, Elijah no longer needed to chase attention. It followed him. Reporters waited at the courthouse gates each morning. Every filing his office submitted was combed through by national outlets, dissected line by columnists and watchdogs. The Bureau had gone quiet. No press briefings, no rebuttals, just internal silence and carefully worded statements through legal counsel that said everything by saying nothing at all. Elijah knew what that meant. Not retreat, not surrender, containment. They were trying to run out the clock, but they had already lost the timing. He scheduled a closed-door presentation before the State Oversight Board, a panel known more for rubber stamping than resistance, and walked into the chamber with nothing but a thick binder under one arm and a small portable projector in his hand. Carmen followed behind him carrying 3 sealed boxes filled with files, evidence logs, signed statements, and forensic reports. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deliver a speech. He simply walked through the evidence piece by piece, name by name, until the room stopped scribbling notes and started listening. He showed them the detainment logs, the deleted metadata, the altered GPS routes logged by Bureau vehicles on nights when suspects disappeared and reappeared hours later, miles from where they were last seen. He showed them the facial recognition logs that had been manipulated to justify stops after the fact. He presented an audio clip recovered by Monroe, a half-minute recording of a conversation between 2 agents discussing whether to hold the kid overnight and figure it out later. There was no interpretation needed. It was clear. At the end of the 2-hour session, He didn't ask for a recommendation or approval. He asked for full investigative authority, statewide. And they granted it, unanimously. The move triggered panic inside the Bureau. Agents began reaching out through back channels, requesting meetings, trying to feel out where they stood in the collapse. Weller disappeared from public view entirely. His badge was quietly deactivated 2 days later, an internal decision made under suspension pending review, but no statement followed. Elijah noted it with little reaction. He had expected more resistance. The silence meant something worse. They were preparing a counterstrike. The night after the board hearing, Carmen found a second surveillance device inside her apartment. Not a tracker, but a listening mic tucked behind a light switch panel in her kitchen. It was clean, sophisticated, not the type used by civilians or local police. She didn't speak when she showed it to Elijah. She just placed it on his desk, wrapped in a towel, and sat across from him with her arms crossed tight across her chest. "They're still trying to figure out what we don't have," she said. "Not how to stop us, how to get ahead of it." Elijah nodded slowly. "Then we don't wait." That Friday, he called a joint meeting between the Inspector General, the Attorney General's office, and 2 federal judges. He brought every file, every statement, every time-stamped message. He laid it out without commentary, without theater, without giving them space to deny what was staring back at them. When one of the federal judges asked if he had confirmation of who had authorized the deleted footage protocol, Elijah handed her a redacted document with 2 names highlighted. She stared at it for a long time before setting it down, saying nothing. Another asked how long Elijah had known the scale of the operation. "I didn't," he said simply. "Not until they tried to silence it." After the meeting, no one shook hands. No one made promises. But the tone had shifted. No more plausible deniability. No more dismissive smiles. For the first time, Elijah saw fear in their eyes. Not fear of exposure, but fear of being tied to something they could no longer excuse. That weekend, the Bureau's D.C. office issued a brief statement announcing a temporary restructuring of the regional unit. It named no agents. It accepted no responsibility. But the timing was no accident. It was their attempt to get ahead of the storm. Carmen met Elijah on the courthouse steps the following Monday morning, her arms full of press packets, each one containing a summary of the findings formatted for the public. Plain language, case photos, names blacked out only where absolutely necessary. They were ready. "You sure about this?" she asked, as they stood before the waiting cameras, microphones angled forward like bayonets. "I'm not doing it for them," Elijah said. "I'm doing it for every person who sat in silence while this was happening, for every name on that board." And with that, he stepped into the crowd and began speaking, not as a prosecutor, not as a politician, but as a witness, naming what had been done and who had done it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The truth had weight now, and the world was finally listening. The public briefing lit the match. What followed wasn't a ripple. It was a surge. Within 24 hours, Elijah's speech had been clipped, shared, and rebroadcast across every major platform, from regional news to national primetime, his calm voice cutting through headlines crowded with spin. He didn't speak in sound bites. He didn't offer outrage or flourish. He just laid it bare. Names, dates, documents, the number of unreported detainments, the internal tampering, the metadata logs, the buildings, the bodies, and the Bureau's silence. That silence cracked by Monday evening. An internal memo, leaked by a junior field agent to the Ledger, revealed that the Bureau's regional office had issued guidance to its agents, instructing them to cease any unauthorized engagements with the media or legal counsel, citing national security risks. The language was thinly veiled intimidation, and the leak confirmed what Elijah had long known. They weren't preparing a defense. They were bracing for collapse. By midweek, a senior agent resigned, not in protest, but in retreat. His name had appeared on 4 of Elijah's flagged transport logs. 2 days later, another agent, this one named in a separate batch of abuse claims, was placed on administrative leave. Then came the email, not to Elijah directly, but to the legal press, from a whistleblower identifying himself only as DF. He claimed to have access to backup copies of deleted arrest footage that included confirmation of off-record detentions and the intentional erasure of booking entries. Within hours, Elijah's office issued a formal request for the whistleblower to submit materials under protected status. The system had turned on itself. Inside the bureau, lines of loyalty frayed fast. Agents began pointing fingers, internal audits launched in every direction, and the department's legal division flooded the oversight board with counterclaims that collapsed the moment subpoenas arrived. Carmen could barely keep up. Every hour brought new folders, new names, new patterns of misconduct unfolding like rot pulled from behind a wall. One of the buildings tied to the shell company was raided, not by Elijah's team, but by the Inspector General's office under emergency order. Inside, they found records, handwritten logs, surveillance schedules, names. One of them belonged to the boy Carmen had traced weeks earlier, the one who'd vanished. It was the first physical proof he'd ever been held. It was also the final piece Judge Doyle needed. She authorized full state seizure of all Bureau-linked satellite offices operating outside standard jurisdiction. The Bureau issued a public denial that same evening, a flat, cold press release dismissing the findings as incomplete and under review. But no one was listening anymore. People had already taken to the streets, not in chaos, not in rage, in presence. They gathered at government buildings, holding up signs not with slogans, but with names. The names Elijah had uncovered, the names that had been redacted for years. Survivors stood before cameras for the first time. Former detainees testified under oath. Clerks who had processed the paperwork that led nowhere came forward. Lawyers who had once been warned to back off returned with files they had kept quietly, waiting for a day like this. Elijah didn't speak at every event. He didn't need to. His presence had become symbolic. His work was already woven through the case files now referenced by every newsroom, every policy committee, every late-night monologue. The truth had outgrown him, and that was exactly what he wanted. Still, there was unfinished business. He returned to the state complex one morning before sunrise, his tie undone, a folder under one arm. He walked through the quiet halls to the basement archives where the original complaint files were stored, the ones that had never moved, never been read, never triggered so much as an internal question. He sat on the concrete bench, opened the file, and read again the very first name, his own. He remembered that day, the sound of the handcuffs, the voice that told him his credentials didn't matter, the heat of the SUV's hood as his cheek pressed against it. He wasn't angry anymore. He was ready. That afternoon, Elijah submitted a formal motion recommending criminal referrals for the agents named in the misconduct files, including Weller. The motion was accompanied by sworn testimony, data logs, internal memos, and a signed letter from Judge Doyle confirming that the Bureau had knowingly and repeatedly violated civil rights through targeted detainment practices with full awareness of their illegality. Carmen delivered the document in person. That evening, the Bureau's Washington headquarters released a new statement. The agency is cooperating with ongoing investigations and will be restructuring leadership in the affected regions. Translation: surrender. The next morning, federal marshals arrived at Weller's home with a sealed warrant. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He was escorted into the back of a car and driven away without fanfare, his badge stripped, his career over. Others followed. Ramirez, Donahue, Stone. One by one, they fell. By the end of the week, the walls that had once protected them were gone, and for the first time in years, the people who had been silenced, erased, buried beneath paperwork and threats, could finally breathe. The hearing was scheduled without fanfare, tucked quietly into the docket under the title State of North Carolina v. Various agents, federal division, but the public knew what it meant. By the time Elijah stepped through the courthouse doors, the plaza was already lined with reporters, community organizers, and survivors who had waited years to be heard. There were no chants, no shouting, just presence, just people standing in quiet solidarity as the system prepared to account for what it had allowed to fester behind closed doors. Inside, the chamber was packed. Elijah stood, not in the audience, but at the prosecution table beside two of his deputy attorneys. Carmen sat behind him in the first row, not as staff, but as witness, as anchor, the person who had helped carry the weight when it threatened to crush them both. The lead federal prosecutor, brought in to oversee the disciplinary referral, read the charges with steady clarity: unlawful detainment, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, civil rights violations under color of law. The list didn't need to be dramatic. It was long enough to speak for itself. The agents didn't speak. Not Weller, not Ramirez, not any of them. They sat with their lawyers, eyes forward, suits pressed, faces blank. Men who had once held power over so many, now reduced to names on a page, stripped of their shields, bound by the very laws they had bent for years. There were no outbursts, no denials, only acknowledgement of the charges and quiet entry of pleas. The judge reviewed the files in silence, flipping through folder after folder, the courtroom so still that even the turning of a page sounded louder than it should have. When she finally spoke, her voice carried not with force, but with finality. This court recognizes that the individuals before us acted not as isolated wrongdoers, but as part of a sustained and coordinated pattern of abuse, protected by institutional neglect and fear. These proceedings are not only necessary for justice, they are necessary for repair. No one clapped. No one cheered. This wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. The terms were set. 3 agents, including Weller, would face federal trial, with bail denied due to risk of interference with ongoing investigations. Others were bound by plea deals and cooperation agreements, their immunity stripped away unless they disclosed full knowledge of the program's operations. Internal bureau oversight boards were dissolved pending independent review. The department's local office would be shuttered permanently. Every case touched by their unit was reopened, and with it came the rest. State policy reform passed the same afternoon, mandating independent civilian review for every federal detainment conducted without charge. A permanent oversight panel was formed with authority to audit both state and federal law enforcement. Funding was redirected from discretionary surveillance programs to community legal advocacy. Elijah's own office was allocated resources to continue the review and compensation effort for the affected individuals. But that wasn't what stayed with him. It wasn't the courtroom, or the judgment, or the sentences read aloud in a clear, measured tone. It was what came after. The small moments. The father who shook his hand at the courthouse steps, eyes wet, voice caught, just saying, "You found my son's name." The woman who had testified behind closed doors weeks earlier, now holding her daughter's hand as they watched from the gallery. The clerk from records, who had once been told to stop asking questions, quietly leaving a box on Elijah's desk the next morning, labeled 1989-1996. records older than he'd expected, untouched for decades. He stayed late that night, not because he had to, because he wasn't ready to close the folder yet. The office was quiet, the hum of the building's vents the only sound, the light overhead soft as he leaned over a new list. Not a list of names to investigate, but names to restore. People whose lives had been derailed by silence. People who would finally have their cases reopened, their records cleared, their dignity returned. It would take time, not weeks, years. But now, there was time. There was space. There was no longer anyone standing in the way. Eric came by the office just past 9. He didn't knock, just stepped in, saw his father surrounded by papers, and sat across from him, quiet for a moment, before asking the only question he hadn't asked during the entire investigation. Was it worth it? Elijah looked at him, tired but clear-eyed, the weight in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. I think it has to be. They didn't talk long, just sat in the quiet, father and son, surrounded by the pieces of something that had finally started to come back together. Not a victory, not revenge, but repair. And for Elijah, that was enough. The wind had shifted by the time fall settled into the city, quieter now, with fewer sirens in the distance and more open windows catching the early light. The courthouse, once a place bristling with tension and expectation, had returned to its usual rhythm. Lawyers pacing marble floors with case files pressed to their chests, clerks moving through halls with practiced calm, and visitors scanning lobby directories without realizing they were standing in the same place where months earlier something much heavier had broken loose. Elijah walked those halls differently now, not with pride or weariness, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had done what needed doing and carried the weight of it in a way that didn't ask for applause. He still arrived early before most of the staff and stayed late when the halls were still. His name had been mentioned on the news less and less as the weeks went on, the public's attention drifting toward other headlines. But that was fine with him. The work hadn't ended when the hearings did. It had only shifted. Nearly 200 cases had been reopened. 47 individuals had received formal apologies, accompanied by financial compensation and record expungement. A review panel, jointly appointed by the state and a coalition of civil rights attorneys, had begun auditing additional detainment logs reaching back 10 years. Elijah had agreed to serve as an independent advisor to the panel, not to lead it, but to ensure no file was dismissed as unimportant. Not again. Some days, the work felt heavier than before, not because of resistance, but because now every door opened, and every story came with truth that could no longer be ignored. Survivors came in with eyes full of memory, carrying folders they had kept for years, some torn and water-damaged, others perfectly preserved. Mothers, sons, veterans, students, all of them stepping into rooms that had once turned them away, now welcomed with quiet deference. Carmen remained by his side through all of it. She had taken a promotion she didn't ask for, now serving as special counsel on oversight implementation, and split her time between offices, but she still called Elijah daily. They met every Friday morning without fail. Same corner cafe, same worn booth near the window, 2 coffees, 1 black, 1 with cream. They spoke less about the case now and more about the aftermath, about what justice looked like when it didn't arrive in a courtroom but in the slow work of restoration. Some stories still haunted them. The young man whose case had sparked the pattern, still missing. His name remained pinned at the top of Elijah's board, not as a lead to be pursued, but as a reminder. The Bureau never disclosed what had happened to him, and no witness had stepped forward with a definitive answer. But Elijah hadn't removed the name. He couldn't. Some things were never closed, only carried. Eric had returned to school with a kind of focus that surprised Elijah. The boy who had once hovered outside his door uncertainly now moved with his shoulders back, asking questions about civil law and due process, writing essays on power and reform. They didn't talk about the night in the alley much, but Elijah had seen the way Eric looked at the courthouse steps the day of the verdict, the way he had stood still as the crowd moved around him, quiet, grounded. It stayed with him. In the weeks following the final sentencing, Elijah received letters. Most came unsigned. Some simply said thank you. Others told stories he'd never heard. Neighbors watching agents move through their streets. Children who didn't know what had happened to a parent until years later. The letters were stored in a drawer in his office, not on display, not for anyone else to read. They weren't trophies. They were testimony. He didn't give interviews. He declined awards. When asked by a local station to speak on what had happened, he offered a single written response. Justice is not a moment. It's the refusal to look away. And that was all. On the last day of the fiscal year, Elijah stood again outside the courthouse, this time not as a prosecutor, not as a witness, but as a man watching the last file of the investigation being delivered to the archive. He didn't follow the box down the hall. He just remained at the threshold, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on the old railing that lined the marble stairs. Carmen joined him minutes later. No need to ask what he was thinking. "They'll rebuild," she said softly. He nodded. "Maybe better this time. And you?" He didn't answer right away. "I think I'll rest. At least a little." The sun was low, casting long shadows across the plaza, the same plaza where everything had started. It looked different now, not cleaner, not brighter, but more honest. A place where silence had finally been broken, where people had stood up, where power had been named and held to account. And somewhere across town, in a small office where legal volunteers worked late into the night, someone else was already starting another folder. Another case, another story. Elijah didn't need to be there. He had done what he came to do. And in that, there was peace. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.